There are a ton of Primarch agendas out there. For example, Lionel Johnson being one of the strongest base Primarchs, Fulgrim if he laid off the ketamine and actually locked in for once, he'd be a top 5 Primarch, or the idea that Lorgar is a straight up bum compared to his brothers. But today, as you probably read the title of this video, I'm going to be pushing one thing, the Rogal Dorn agenda. Now I know what some of you are probably thinking. Dorn, the wall guy? The fortification merchant? The human embodiment of drywall? Yeah, that guy. And I'm here to say that if Dorn did indeed return, he might be one of the strongest Primarchs in the current setting. We're talking about a Primarch with one of the few confirmed Primarch kills, a man who's gone toe-to-toe with the demon Primarch and survived, and made even Khorne want a slice of that cake. By the end of this video, you're either going to fully embrace the Dorn agenda, or may find yourself trapped inside your house besieged. So let's stop playing around and jump straight into the cowhole. Because I'm dead serious about my Pookie's agenda. It's time to fortify my argument and push the Rogal Dorn agenda. So before I start pushing this, as always, what exactly is an agenda? In power scaling, an agenda is basically when someone picks their favorite character and builds the strongest possible case for them using feats, statements, and lore, while conveniently not focusing too hard on their anti-feats. Sometimes agendas are complete nonsense. They're pure cope and delusion of the highest order. But sometimes they're actually backed by some pretty scary evidence. And let me tell you guys, the Rogal Dorn agenda has the evidence and excerpts to back it all up. That when you stack Dorn up against the other Primarchs, both Loyalist and Traitor, there is a very real argument that he may actually belong at the top of the Primarch power rankings.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
So let's begin by discussing the various statements we have on Papa Dorn that upscale him tremendously. First off, Rogal Dorn is said by Horus in The End and the Death to be the finest martial exponent that he has ever known. This would mean that Dorn is the ultimate living embodiment of martial skill in Horus's eyes. And Horus has seen all of his brothers in action and seems to be placing Dorn even above himself. And don't forget folks, Horus has direct statements comparing him to the lion in martial skill. So right off the bat, we have a statement that Rogal Dorn, admitted by Horus, is one of the finest fighters among the Primarchs. Then we have Dorn's own thoughts on facing his traitorous brothers in the short story, The Lightning Tower. What was he afraid of? Who was he afraid of? Angron? Not him. Dorn would split his head without compunction if they came face to face. Lorgar? Magnus? There had always been a fetid whiff of sorcery about those two, but Dorn felt nothing towards them he could describe as fear. Fulgrim? No. The Phoenician was a singular foe, but not an object of terror. Perturabo? Well now, their rivalry was old, the spiteful scrappings of two brothers who fought for a father's attention. No, he was not afraid of Perturabo. So here in this short story, we see that Rogal Dorn is not afraid to face Perturabo, Fulgrim, Lorgar, Magnus, or Angron, even going as far to say that he would split Angron's head if they ever came face to face, implying that Dorn thinks he could beat Angron in a duel. Then we have this statement from Malcador in the book The Lost and the Damned, implying that Rogal Dorn is the master of the physical world. Was it? Said Malcador softly. Very well, let us take you, Dorn. You were made to command the material realm. Nothing in this world is beyond your grasp. This is most likely in regard to Rogal Dorn's warp power, which allows him to suppress the warp with his willpower alone. And this statement seems to add to that by Malcador suggesting that Dorn can master any concept of the material universe. But that's not the only glazing statement he has, as most recently in the book Ashes of the Imperium, he has a statement from Corswain comparing him to both Leman Russ and Lionel Johnson, two of the strongest base Primarchs. He stole a glance at Dorn as he withdrew again, this was a gathering of equals in all important respects. If any of them had come into serious conflict with the others, it would have been hard to pick a winner. And yet for all the trials both his own liege and Russ had endured, Dorn bore the scars of the war more deeply. So this statement is directly comparing Rogal Dorn to both Lionel Johnson and Leman Russ, two Primarchs who are consistently considered among the strongest of their kin. The Lion is regularly described as one of the greatest duelists and one of the fastest as well, due to feats like blitzing the future sight of Conrad Kurz, and in the modern setting of 40k, he has even managed to defeat a demon Primarch, Angron, during the Arc of Omens. While on the other hand, Leman Russ fought the Lion to a standstill for 3 straight days in the book The Great Wolf, has defeated Magnus the Red during the Burning of Prospero, even if Magnus wasn't at his full strength, and with the help of the Dionysian Spear, managed to wound post-Molech Horus during the book Wolfsbane. Now Russ is absolutely a context man. Half of his scaling comes with a giant asterisk attached, but even with all of that context, he's undeniably one of the strongest base Primarchs. And here, we have Corswain directly stating that if Dorn, the Lion, and Russ all came into serious conflict with each other, he genuinely could not say who would emerge victorious. So yeah, Dorn has some absolutely generational glazing statements on him.
Diabolical, the most dangerous, a beast slayer, a conqueror's conqueror, the goat of all goats, so that they...
But now let's move on to his 2 Primarch fights during the Horus Heresy, because this is where we really start to see how powerful he truly is. Starting with his duel against Alfarius. This takes place in Praetorian of Dorn. And I'm not gonna lie folks, Alfarius comes off like an absolute silly goose in this duel. Like the man launches a massive invasion of the Sol system, unleashes sleeper cells that kills millions, and then starts preaching to Dorn about the meaning of true victory. Like imagine I invaded your house with all of my buddies, set fire to your garage, pantry, and bathroom, and then try to convince you that I'm actually on your side and have the secret ingredient to the Krabby Patty. Now, of course, you're not going to believe me. And unfortunately for Alfarius, Dorn doesn't either. But I guess that's just Alfarius for you. Schizophrenic to the very end.
Stop making schizophrenia jokes, they're not funny.
Alex, I'm right here.
I know, get it?
Stop making schizophrenia jokes, they're not funny.
Hey, look man, it's my condition. I should be able to have a sense of humor about my condition.
Their fight begins with Dorn and Alfarius tearing through each other's Terminator bodyguards, before Alfarius attempts to backstab Dorn. It was a beautiful strike. In all his years of war, Archimus had never seen the like. Its simplicity like a line drawn by a master artisan on bare parchment. It was death and ruin and silence without end. And Storm's teeth met the spear thrust, and reality shrieked. A sheet of silver sparks exploded from the point at which the 2 weapons met. Alfarius and Dorn stood before each other, and it was as though the universe made space for this meeting of brothers. The 2 Primarchs then proceed to fight, and they trade blows for quite some time as Alfarius attempts to convince Dorn of true victory. And Alfarius even manages to bait Dorn into an overextended strike, or at least what he thought was one. Alfarius was not overextended. He was exactly where he needed to be to turn past Dorn's blow and make another. Last perfect thrust with his spear. Dorn cut. Storm's teeth blurred. Alfarius swayed back, pivoting and sliding a hair's breadth past the screaming edge. And the spear struck home. It rammed through Dorn's armor and into the flesh, and stopped. Dorn stood, unmoved. The spear embedded in his shoulder where he had stepped into to take the blow. His left hand was locked around the spear's haft. For an instant, the 2 Primarchs were an arm's reach apart, eye to eye. Brother, Alfarius began, and Dorn hacked Storm's teeth through Alfarius' arms above the wrists. Rogal Dorn brought Storm's teeth around. The blade cut down through Alfarius' skull and then tore free in a spray of blood and a detonation of light.
Good, Anakin, good.
Kill this bald schizophrenic loser. Eat shit, traitor. So here we have Rogal Dorn straight up killing Alfarius without taking any real serious damage in return, as he essentially tanks Alfarius' killing blow just to Count Dooku his ass immediately afterwards. Now I will admit the two were going relatively even with each other for quite some time, but I would not call this a high diff fight for Dorn. If anything, it leans closer to low to mid diff. The two trade blows for a portion of their duel. Dorn allows himself to be impaled by the pale spear, and then quickly finishes off Alfarius before he can react. I could see an argument for high diff, because I know the Alpha Legion fans out there will say, Alfarius wasn't trying to kill Dorn, Cal. He was merely trying to tell him about true victory. Like, I guess, bro. But regardless of how difficult you think it was, Dorn still was able to defeat and kill a fellow Primarch, even going as far as to tank the Pale Spear, which is a Xenos weapon, mind you, that is said to vaporize anything that comes in contact with it. And Dorn just tanks it like an absolute G. Even if Alfarius isn't usually ranked among the absolute top tier of the Primarchs, he is still a Primarch. A being that can move faster than thought, lift hundreds of tons, and casually slaughter Space Marines. So Rogal Dorn is 1-0. But now we move on to his next major Primarch fight. And this one is significantly more controversial. It's his duel against Demon Primarch Fulgrim in the book Saturn. And this fight is just so weird, guys. Because depending on how you interpret Fulgrim's personality, his motivations, and later codex statements, this duel can be either viewed as a massive anti-feat for Fulgrim, or one of the single greatest upscales for Dorn in the entire setting. Their fight occurs after Fulgrim breaches the Saturn IX wall and encounters Dorn, and the two immediately begin to trade blows. But almost instantly, a pattern begins to emerge. Fulgrim launches attack after attack, but Dorn just keeps shutting him down. Dorn's blow knocked the next words out of his mouth. Fulgrim stumbled. Dorn's greatsword tore into his ribs. Fulgrim struck back, but found only shield again. And this kind of becomes the story of their entire fight. Fulgrim monologues and then attacks with speed and skill, but Dorn continuously absorbs, redirects, or blocks nearly everything thrown at him. Dorn blocked into him, broke his guard with his shield, buried his blade in Fulgrim's shoulder meat, then body smashed him across the platform. And the disrespect here is honestly insane. Dorn isn't fighting like he's barely surviving against some superior being. He's fighting, quite frankly, like an unstoppable wall, crushing Fulgrim through sheer attrition. And through it all, Fulgrim is trying to provoke Dorn into some emotional response. But Dorn remains silent throughout their fight, with his only words telling Fulgrim again and again that he's going to kill him. Fulgrim surged and hammered out 9 rapid blows, each one a master killstroke. Dorn blocked each one. The Phoenician growled and charged 2 steps. Dorn met his first slash with his shield and countered his second with his blade. A third he parried, a fourth he turned aside in a squealing slide of steel that threw off sparks. This is pretty much how their duel goes for 3.5 pages. Fulgrim barely lands any hits, while Dorn continuously pressures and wounds Fulgrim for the duration of their duel. When it finally ends, Fulgrim is viciously wounded. Dorn struck out and severed Fulgrim's left wrist so the hand was left hanging by a shred of flesh. Dorn drove the entire length of his blade through Fulgrim's belly. This is basically the end of their fight, as Fulgrim heals himself, starts whining about pain, and then abandons the siege entirely by dramatically teleporting away like the galaxy's pettiest quitter. Now the reason this fight is debated so heavily is because Fulgrim performs, well, quite strangely. Not only does he lose pretty badly overall, as he barely damages Dorn while receiving cut after cut in return, but he also refuses to use many of the abilities we know Demon Primarch Fulgrim possesses. He doesn't use any of his psychic abilities, his flight, or poison in the way we've seen in other fights. Instead, he engages Dorn almost entirely in a straight-up martial contest. And you could make the argument that's because of Fulgrim's personality. Fulgrim is monstrously prideful. He sees himself as perfection incarnate, especially when it comes to swordsmanship and martial skill. So there is a legitimate argument that he intentionally chose to fight Dorn fairly, because he wanted to prove his superiority as the better duelist. And if that's your interpretation, then yes, it arguably makes the feat less impressive for Mr. Papa Dorn. But folks, of course there's a but, there are two codex statements that completely change this power scaling conversation. First, we have this statement from the 3rd edition Horus Heresy Codex, which states, "As Fulgrim grew ever greater in his patron's regard, his focus became ever less on his legion and more towards the attainment of personal glory, seeking out any whose martial prowess approached his own and humbling them." Now this is huge because it directly implies that Fulgrim is specifically seeking out opponents who are actually near him in martial skill. So he is not interested in bullying random fodder, and is actively seeking out worthy opponents that are able to give him a challenge. Which means the fact that he is fighting Dorn this seriously at all strongly suggests that Dorn's martial prowess is legitimately relative enough to interest Fulgrim in the first place. But somehow, folks, it gets even crazier. Because then we get this statement from the 10th edition Emperor's Children Codex that says, "In the wake of his physical being becoming a vessel for the powers of the warp, Fulgrim's form became nigh indestructible. Despite his virtual immortality, Fulgrim's monstrous pride often ensured that should a foe threaten to best him, he would dramatically leave the battlefield, denying them the satisfaction of besting him in combat." Yeah, that sounds a little too similar to something. Oh yeah, that's exactly what happens in Saturn 9. You genuinely can't make this shit up. In his fight against Dorn, Fulgrim spends the entire duel getting progressively more frustrated, progressively more wounded, and the second the fight starts shifting in Dorn's favor, Fulgrim just leaves. And he doesn't just leave, he does it dramatically. Exactly like the Codex says he does. So we have the narrative and codex material both strongly suggesting that Dorn was legitimately pushing Fulgrim towards defeat.
This is the worst!
That does not necessarily mean Dorn is stronger than Demon Primarch Fulgrim overall, in every conceivable circumstance, since Fulgrim does not use his warp powers, immortality, regeneration, and other warp abilities during their fight. But what it does mean is that in a straight up fight, Dorn performed so well that Fulgrim, one of the proudest beings in the galaxy, decided that fleeing the battlefield was preferable to risking an outright loss. And for the Rogal Dorn agenda, this is absolutely generational propaganda material. Because let's really think about what Dorn is accomplishing here. Fulgrim is not some random demon prince. This is a demon Primarch. He can move faster than Quicksilver, casually flip tanks with ease, and even his mere presence can overwhelm other Primarchs with his toxic musk. For example, we see this directly with his fight against Rabute Guilliman in Dark Imperium. Guilliman staggered, gasping. Every breath poured more of Fulgrim's lethal perfume into his lungs, a poison so potent that it taxed his superhuman body. He parried and parried again, but he could land no counterstrike and was forced back up the stairs. Fulgrim, at the conclusion of his fight with Guilliman, even manages to mortally wound the Blueberry. Even outside of this single Primarch duel, Fulgrim also defeated Ferrus Manus during the Dropsite Massacre, and in the Reflection Cracked, we saw him use his psychic powers to crush a Titan. But when Dorn fights Fulgrim, he only receives a few wounds, most of which are relatively minor compared to what Fulgrim dealt Guilliman, or the Headless Wonder. That is an absolutely insane difference in overall performance. All of this really does suggest that Dorn may be indeed one of the strongest base Primarchs. If we're talking objectively here, with no bias, the top 5 base Primarchs are usually Magnus the Red, Sanguinius, the Lion, Horus, and either Conrad Kurz or Lehman Russ. And since Dorn has statements comparing him to 2 of the Primarchs in the top 5, has defeated a Demon Primarch and a Base Primarch himself. I think the evidence clearly shows that Dorn is at least top 7 or top 8, with the possibility of maybe even being a top 5 Base Primarch. Further suggesting that if Dorn were to return in the modern setting, that there would be a very real possibility that he could rival or even potentially surpass Lionel Johnson as the strongest current Loyalist Primarch. Now you're probably asking yourself, why do I say this? Cow, didn't the Lion also defeat a Demon Primarch? And not just any Demon Primarch, Angron as well. Well folks, what if I told you that Rogal Dorn is more than just a handsome king? Because it appears that he too also possesses a unique warp power. We briefly touched on it earlier, but now we're going to go deeper into the cowhole. This ability seems to be focused around his willpower. For example, in The End and the Death, he was stuck in an endless desert for centuries. And while he was there, he resisted the corruption of chaos by Khorne, who continuously attempted to convince Dorn to give in to his rage and bloodthirst. But Dorn refused him in the most Dorn way imaginable, saying, "I am Rogal Dorn, Praetorian, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, seven-found son, defiant and unyielding."
Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool!
Yeah, so Dorn is so autistic and so unyielding that Khorne is forced to give up. And this willpower seems to extend far beyond simply refusing a Chaos God, which of course is an insane feat all on its own. But it also appears that his willpower is so strong that it seems to actively affect the warp around him. We see this in the book The Solar War. Father, breathed Massac. In his mortal sight, Dorn and the demon were a blur, a giant of shadow and ghostly flesh, and a demigod of war gleaming against the darkness. Cold control poured from Dorn, cracking the flow of the warp, splintering the folding dark as it spiraled around him. So yeah, Dorn is shown being able to affect the warp, causing it to splinter and crack under his influence. And that is where things start getting real interesting for a hypothetical modern-day Dorn return. Because if characters like the Lion can develop new abilities like Forest Walk, or if Corvus Corax can evolve into a literal shadow demon bird creature, then it's entirely possible Dorn's own warp-related abilities would evolve as well. And since his ability seems to revolve around his willpower and possibly nullifying the warp, then Dorn has the potential to become, get this, something resembling a null. Now I don't mean in the exact same way as, say, the Sisters of Silence, but more as a Primarch whose indomitable will actively suppresses and fractures the warp around him. And maybe just like Corvus Corax, Rogal Dorn may be able to control this nullifying area of effect. And if that version of Dorn were to return wielding something like the Emperor's Lightning Claw to, replace his missing hand, a relic potentially comparable to the Emperor's sword or shield, giving him a weapon possesses a hint of the Emperor's power and should be highly effective against Chaos-aligned foes. This would result in Rogal Dorn becoming the perfect weapon against the warp. Think about it. Most of the Imperium's strongest enemies rely heavily on warp abilities, corruption, fear, or reality manipulation. Beings like demons, psychers, greater demons, or even the demon Primarchs. So if Dorn's latent warp abilities truly evolved in the direction hinted at during the Solar War, then he may become the Imperium's greatest weapon against the forces of chaos. I mean, imagine a demon Primarch trying to drown a battlefield in warp energy, only for Dorn's mere presence to suppress and fracture their attempt. Imagine greater demons finding their unnatural forms destabilizing around him. Imagine psychic attacks weakening, reality distortion collapsing, or corruption simply failing to take root, because Dorn's will is so absolute that the warp itself struggles to exist around him. This can make him the greatest threat to his fallen brethren, especially those like Magnus the Red, whose greatest strength is his psychic powers. Physically, Magnus is of course still dangerous. He is a demon Primarch after all, but his mastery over the warp allows him to shatter titans with his mind, manipulate time, space, and reality, and even atomize his fellow Primarchs. But if Dorn could actively suppress or disrupt warp energies around him, suddenly Magnus loses access to the very thing that made him insanely powerful. Meaning, he would have to face Dorn in a strictly physical contest. And we all saw how Demon Primarch Fulgrim fared against Dorn in Saturn 9. So it's very possible that Dorn could beat the strongest Demon Primarch after all. And this wouldn't just apply to Magnus either. It could potentially affect all of the Demon Primarchs, since you know they are warp beings. And if Dorn's mere presence actively disrupts the warp around him, then that would mean his traitor brothers would have to fight him in a nerf state. For example, Angron's regeneration and warp field rage would weaken, or Lorgar's psychic powers would become unstable or less effective, or maybe even Perturabo's unnatural demon durability would begin to diminish. So if Dorn did indeed return, equipped with a relic from the Emperor's arsenal, most likely the Emperor's Lightning Claw, alongside his prior physical capabilities, which allowed him to slice up a Demon Primarch, and with the addition of his hypothetical anti-warp abilities, then my agenda that Rogal Dorn would be the strongest Primarch if he did return starts sounding like a genuine possibility. Man oh man, my Pookie's agenda lives on. Let me know down below if you believe in the Rogal Dorn agenda. Is it legitimate, or have I finally inhaled too much Imperial Fist propaganda? A shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members: Impossy Paul, Zy Blinky, Tyler Pick 7, Ritter S, Musty, Keydree, Seth Capizilla, Lag, Connie Karkle, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, and Michael Skipper 7277. If you guys want to support my channel further, I would greatly appreciate you guys subscribing to my Patreon or YouTube members. But as I always say on this channel, I will never hide anything behind a paywall, because fuck capitalism. As always, my beloved herd, stay milked, and I'll see you all real soon.